Hello everybody, in the video today I'm talking about the 10 most emotionally disturbing things you're probably going to have to deal with once you realize your mom or your dad is suffering from dementia. My name is Dawn Dickinson. The channel is Living Your Best Life Over 55, and today's list I have compiled based on mostly my own experiences with my mother, who was diagnosed with both vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease about 5 years ago, but also recently some of my friends have had their moms or dads pass away from the disease. So these are things I have come up with from my own experiences and things that my friends have just recently lived through when their moms or dads have passed away from this horrible, debilitating disease. So the very first thing that is extremely emotionally taxing is when you realize that there's something not right with your mom or dad, but you're not sure exactly what's going on. In fact, maybe if you're the one who spends the most time with your parent, you might see it before your siblings. And so now you've got to try to talk to your brothers or sisters to try to convince them or try to see what they're thinking. Is something really going wrong? Talking to your friends, you're not trying to be disrespectful to your parent, but yet at the same time you're worried and you're trying to come up with the course of action. The second thing that could happen is once you realize something is dreadfully wrong, this happened in my own case with my mother, is trying to call her doctors and have them do something to take some course of action. And you call the doctor and you say, my mother's having these symptoms and I would like you to evaluate her, call her in for an appointment. And the first thing they're going to say is, do you have power of attorney medically? And often, especially if your parent is younger, this has not been an issue before, so you don't have power of attorney at this moment, and so it can take a long time to get any action, any activity going on towards your parent's diagnosis. So the very early stages are disturbing, especially if you're the one that sees your parent the most and you have to convince your siblings or your mother's friends that there's something wrong, and then get the doctors on board and to make something happen to get a diagnosis and a next steps for what you need to do to treat the disease. The second thing that's difficult is once you do finally have a diagnosis, some of the things that you're going to have to do. The very first thing is when they say, oh my goodness, you have to take her car away. She cannot drive. So trying to convince your mom or dad that you're selling their car and they're no longer going to be able to drive, they're no longer going to have that independence, that is very difficult when you see the pain in their eyes. And then sometimes at that point they're also going to say she cannot live alone and you may have to move her into assisted living, a nursing home, or memory care. Now in my own mother's situation, she wanted to move into assisted living. In fact, she had talked for months prior that, oh, I want to live in one of those nice assisted living places where I have a great apartment and they cook my meals and there's activities and all sorts of people my own age. So she had come up with the assisted living idea beforehand, but once the doctor said she can't live alone, then you have the difficult task of selling her house, moving her out of her house, getting rid of all her things, researching which facilities are the best for her, trying to come up with a budget. How are you going to pay for all this? So all the stuff that goes into getting your mom's place sold and moved into the best place for her, that is a very difficult and emotionally draining task. And in our case, what had happened is it took so long to get the diagnosis going that we had to move her twice. We moved her first into the assisted living place, which was fantastic. If she could have just stayed there, it would have been a great place. But very quickly after moving her in, within 6 months, we had to move her out. And probably the first thing that had happened is she had fallen in the evening and she was wearing a life alert pendant. All she would have had to do is push the button and they would have come in and rescued her. But because she was so mentally far gone, she didn't even know what it was. So she's on the floor the entire evening into the next morning until a caregiver came in and found her, and she'd been on the floor all night. And at that point the doctors agreed we need to put her into a memory care facility where she had 24 hours of people looking in on her and making sure she's okay. So moving her twice, just the realization that even assisted living isn't enough care for her. It all happened very quickly, and this is very difficult to deal with. Okay, the number 3 thing that is extremely hard to deal with is when the first time you have to change your parent's diaper. Now, I don't want to say, oh, I'm too good to change my mom's diaper. That wasn't it at all. Of course, changing an adult's diaper is really gross, but it's the gravity of the situation when you realize that your parents' mind and brain is so damaged that it can no longer control their bowels, and this is the situation they're in, that you're in diapers and you're changing diapers. That is what's so emotionally disturbing about having to change your mom's diaper. Just because you realize their brain is shutting down, they can no longer do the basic functions of controlling the bowels. That is very disturbing when you have to do that for the very first time. Okay, so the 4th thing that is very disturbing is at some point in your parents' illness, they're going to end up in the hospital. Something's going to happen, they're going to fall, they're going to have a festering wound, because what happens is they'll get a tiny nick in the skin and their body no longer has a good immune system, and then they'll get infected and you'll have to go to the hospital. They'll be in the hospital. That is a daunting experience, but what's really daunting about that is the behaviors that start happening, because they don't want to be in the hospital. They're calling you up, demanding you come take them home, screaming at you. My mother at one point was in the hospital. She calls 911 and says she's been kidnapped and held against her will, and the police need to come and get her. That was one thing. The other thing is she starts attacking the nurses, hitting the nurses, biting the nurses. Now here you have a once sweet old lady that has now gone violent. So these changes in behavior that are often instigated when they're put into the hospital for the first time, really, really difficult to deal with emotionally. So just brace yourself in case that does happen. It may not happen with every patient, but I think it does happen quite often with patients with the dementia, because it is a long illness with a long time to decline, and hospital stays are likely going to happen during the duration of this illness. Okay, so number 5 for me might have been the very worst turning point in my mother's disease, is when she's no longer able to answer the phone or call out on the phone. So for my whole life, I talked to my mom every day, maybe every other day on the phone. If I couldn't see her, I would call her. Hey, how you doing, Mom? And even while she was in assisted living or the hospital or the early stages of the memory care, I would still call and check up on her every day, and we'd have a nice conversation. But at some point, she stopped answering the phone. And then at one point, she never could answer the phone or dial the phone again. Not that she doesn't want to talk, but because she doesn't understand how the phone works. She no longer has any idea what the phone is, how to answer it, how to make a phone call. And so that's very disturbing when you get to the point that now I'm not able to call my mother every day. In fact, now the only time I can talk to my mother is when I am visiting her in the memory care facility. And since I don't live in the same town as her, that's probably only happening once a month or so. So the fact that I went from talking to my mother on the phone every day or every other day to now only speaking to her when I'm visiting in person was very difficult, very emotional, and still really hard to this day for me to deal with. Okay, the 6th really disturbing thing that happens, and it probably is going to happen to you at some point if your parent has the dementia, is when they look at you straight in the eye and they says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. Could you tell me what your name is?" And you realize your parent doesn't know who you are. Wow. I mean, that hits you right in the heart, and you're like, "Oh, Mom, it's me, it's Dawn, I'm your daughter." And then she's like, "Oh, okay," pretending she knows, but she actually doesn't know. The first time you realize your parent has no idea who you are, that is extremely disturbing, really hard to deal with. Now, number 7 is also pretty difficult for me, and this has probably only been happening the last 6 months to a year or so, when I'm visiting my mother and she says, "Do you know where my husband Jack is? I haven't seen him for a while." And you're like, holy crap. So we got a double whammy here. First, when she asks where her husband Jack is, that makes me know she doesn't know who I am, right? Because otherwise she'd say, where's your dad? And the second thing is that she now does not remember the most devastating event that has happened in our family's history, and that is when she 20 years ago came home from an all-day art seminar and found my father dead of a heart attack on the floor. Becoming a widow at 62 years old, doesn't remember. Doesn't remember the paramedics, doesn't remember the drama, doesn't remember the funeral, doesn't remember that he has not been here for 20 years. That is disturbing. And then if in the initial stages you're like, Mom, Dad died 20 years ago, and then you see it on her face like it's the first time she finds out her husband is dead. She starts crying, and you relive the emotion of losing your other parent all over again. Now, this pretty much now happens every time I see her. She's asking where her husband is, like she has no idea. 20 years. In fact, almost 20 years to the day that my father left us. So she does it to me, she does it when my sister visits, she does it when my brother visits. Now, the other thing she's been asking, she actually hasn't been asking for her mother. She's talking about how she sees her mother. Now, her mother died in 1995, and then her father died in 2007. So she is all the time talking about, oh, your grandmother was here. Or actually, she doesn't say that. She'll say, my mother was here, because she probably has no idea who I am. It's just some nice lady that's visiting her while she's in this place where she actually has no idea where she's at. She thinks it's a motel one day, it's an apartment one day. So again, she'll be talking about her mother was here and her mother did her nails, or her mother brought her that coat that's laying on the chair. So always talking about her mother like her mother's here, even though her mother's been dead for almost 30 years. Is that right? And then talking about my dad, where's your dad? Or where's my husband? Dead for 20 years, doesn't remember that, doesn't remember the devastating emotional impact it had on our entire family when he died, and is looking like, where is he? Now we just say he's working late, because I don't want to relive that horrible thing every time I see her. So that is one of the worst parts of the dementia, is when they start forgetting that people that are in your family have died for years. Very, very emotional, and I'm sorry if that's going to happen to you, but it could very easily happen. Okay, so issue number 9, I think is very disturbing. The last few times I've seen her, she can almost not even remember how to talk. Now, she can talk, she just will start talking, and she'll say, did you know I went to and she will forget. She won't know words. Like, she can no longer construct a sentence and have conversations with people, because she'll get a couple of words into a sentence and then forget. She'll forget what she was talking about, but more, she just cannot remember the words to express what she is thinking. So that is very, very disturbing. Now, number 9 for me is this just happened a couple of weeks ago, when hospice calls and says, look, we've seen your mother, and we're hospice. These people are hospice, right? They deal with dying patients all the time. We think your mother has a couple of weeks to maybe 6 months to live, so get your orders, get your affairs in orders, and then you have to go to the cemetery and order, pay for a plot or whatever your final arrangements, you're making those. You're getting things in order when the gravity, now this is coming for years, and yet when they say a few weeks to a few months, it like really hits hard, then you start crying again, even though my mother has been gone. Like, she's not in there for 5 years, but I cannot stand watching her suffer. I know she's miserable, but when they say the finality of a few weeks to a few months, it really hits difficult. Now, number 10 hasn't happened to me yet, is when they finally pass away. Now, my good friend's mother just passed away from the same illness a few months ago, and I could kind of see how it is. It's a whole basket of emotions. You're feeling sad, you're feeling grief, you're feeling somewhat of a relief, you're feeling like, oh, now she's on the other side, happy to be with her parents and her husband, and maybe it's happy for her, but then the finality of, wow, my mom is really gone, the grief. Now, I haven't had this happen yet because she has not passed. She's very close. Of course, though, about a year ago, they thought she was going to pass, and then she kind of came out of it, but now they're saying, no, she isn't very bad shape. So I imagine the finality when the parent finally goes is going to be very difficult, and it's going to be a mix of emotion because of the long prolonged illness. But number 10 is probably the final passing. That is going to be, again, all of these things very difficult emotionally, especially if you're a child, especially if you were a caregiver, and if you were ever close to your parents, just going to be a difficult thing. So I'm sorry for any of you that are watching this video because you just recently realized that your parents are going to have this long, difficult decline. But just realize it's happening a lot more often than it used to, and there are many of us here that understand what you're going through, and hopefully you will find other videos to give you more information. I do have several on this channel, but there are other whole channels devoted to this topic, so there are great resources for you. My name's Dawn Dickinson. I hope you find the information in the video helpful. If you liked the video, or at least found it helpful, please do me a favor and hit the like button, the subscribe button. I do post every single week on the channel, not always about dementia, but usually topics to help us live better lives, and I'll be supportive of each other.